The streets trembled not from thunder but from voices. From Ouagadougou to Washington, from Accra to New York, thousands lifted fists and banners that read one unshakable demand: hands off the AES, hands off Africa. It was not a routine protest. It was a storm of dignity. Burkina Faso flags waved alongside the stars and stripes, creating a vision no camera could truly capture. The question spread quickly through newsrooms and living rooms alike: how could Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a 37-year-old soldier from Burkina Faso, inspire such loyalty across oceans? For centuries, Africa's fate was scripted by outsiders. Its gold filled foreign vaults, its soil hosted foreign armies, its people were lectured about democracy by powers that never respected them. Yet here rose a new figure. Captain Ibrahim spoke with clarity: enough theft, enough interference, enough silence. His defiance struck a chord not only in Ouagadougou but in Chicago, Atlanta, and Harlem. Stay with us, because this is not just another story. It is the future our ancestors dreamed of. Subscribe and join us, for an Africa that no longer bows its head backhand index pointing right. If you believe Africa deserves its own voice, drop a comment below and subscribe right now. When Ibrahim Traoré first appeared on the world stage in 2022, few outside West Africa even recognized his name. Yet within months, this young officer from Burkina Faso would become a figure of defiance whose choices would shake the old order. At 37 years old, he was not content to be a caretaker of colonial leftovers. He demanded that Burkina Faso, a land of more than 22 million citizens, chart its own future free from the shadow of Paris and Washington. The coup that brought him to power was controversial, yes, but for many ordinary Burkinabe it felt less like a seizure and more like a liberation. French soldiers who had patrolled Ouagadougou for years were suddenly ordered out. The long-standing military agreements that tied Burkina Faso to its former colonial master were scrapped. In their place, new partnerships emerged: agreements with Russia, discussions with Mali and Niger, and a stronger embrace of the alliance of Sahel states. To his supporters, these decisions were not reckless gambles. They were bold steps toward dignity. Western capitals did not see it that way. Editorials in Paris spoke of instability. Commentators in Washington muttered about another strongman. Yet inside Burkina Faso, the mood was different. Street murals appeared showing Traoré in military uniform, painted alongside slogans calling for sovereignty. In villages, elders spoke of him as a continuation of Thomas Sankara's unfinished dream. For the first time in decades, the people felt their leaders' words echoed their frustrations: why must Africa remain poor when its gold enriches foreign banks? Why must every major decision be rubber-stamped in Paris? The defiance grew louder when Traoré refused to renew mining concessions that favored European companies. He insisted profits remain inside Burkina Faso's borders, to build schools, hospitals, and roads rather than fatten distant shareholders. International markets panicked, but local communities cheered. They remembered generations of extraction: cotton, cocoa, gold flowing outward while poverty remained. Traoré's vow to reverse that cycle gave them something they had not felt in years: hope. And hope can be dangerous to those who thrive on despair. By late 2023, whispers began spreading in Western intelligence circles that Traoré was aligning too closely with Moscow, that he was undermining the balance in the Sahel. Analysts called him unpredictable, even reckless. But among African youth, from Dakar to Lagos, his speeches circulated online as fiery declarations of self-respect. Clips of him saying Africa needed no permission from Europe to live free were shared millions of times. This is where the story becomes more than national politics. It becomes a generational awakening. Across the continent and the diaspora, people began to see Captain Ibrahim not just as the leader of one state, but as the face of a broader struggle. His rise told every grandmother in Harlem and every youth in Accra the same truth: Africa could stand tall again. The phrase Burkina Faso latest news no longer meant another headline of crisis. It meant evidence that the old chains were breaking. It meant a soldier's voice carrying further than expected. It meant a spark had caught flame. And once that flame spread, it was no longer only about Burkina Faso. It was about an entire continent daring to ask, if not now, when? Backhand index pointing right. If you believe this fire should never be extinguished, type Africa Rise in the comments and subscribe so you never miss the next chapter of this story. By the final days of April 2025, the cry for Africa's dignity had spilled far beyond Ouagadougou. What began as demonstrations in the capital of Burkina Faso quickly cascaded into one of the largest waves of coordinated protest the diaspora had ever seen. It was not confined to one city or even one continent. It became a living map of resistance, stretching from West Africa to Europe, from the heart of America to the islands of the Caribbean. In Washington, D.C., thousands gathered outside Lafayette Square. They held placards painted with bold letters, "Leave Ibrahim Tra alone" and "Africa for Africans." Streets that normally pulsed with the rhythm of traffic were brought to a standstill. Protesters locked arms, chanting in unison, while drummers from the African diaspora beat rhythms that echoed ancestral memories. The police struggled to redirect traffic, yet the demonstrators refused to move. For hours, the city's political heart was silenced, not by force, but by collective will. New York followed the same rhythm but added its own defiant tone. From Harlem to Times Square, banners of Burkina Faso fluttered high. Elders from the African American community joined hands with recent immigrants, chanting, "Hands off AES, hands off Africa." Taxi drivers honked in solidarity, and onlookers recorded the scenes, instantly uploading them to social media. Hashtags surged, not only in English but also in French, Arabic, and local African languages. The digital sphere mirrored the streets, multiplying the message until it became impossible to ignore. Los Angeles added its own dramatic flair. Highways were blocked as crowds spilled onto asphalt. Cars halted, engines switched off, and people turned traffic jams into stages of protest. Chants rang out, "Ibrahim Traoré, our hero. Africa is rising." From the hilltops of Hollywood to the palm-lined boulevards, the city carried a sound it had not heard in decades, an echo of global justice. Chicago, too, stood tall. Protesters occupied bridges across the Chicago River. The sight of African flags against the backdrop of skyscrapers created an unforgettable image, a declaration that Africa's fate could not be separated from the struggles of black communities in America. Churches opened their doors to offer food and water to demonstrators, a reminder of the civil rights era when faith and resistance walked hand in hand. But it was not only the United States. Across the Atlantic, London became a focal point. On April 30th, hundreds gathered outside the U.S. Embassy. They chanted against interference, waving banners that read, "Stop destabilizing Africa." Speakers invoked the names of Thomas Sankara, Kwame Nkrumah, and Marcus Garvey, linking Captain Ibrahim to a legacy of defiance stretching back more than a century. British police monitored closely, but the protests remained disciplined, purposeful, and profoundly symbolic. Brussels and Berlin soon echoed the same calls. The European Union, long a beneficiary of Africa's resources, found its capitals confronted by the very diaspora whose ancestors had paid the price of empire. Even in smaller cities, Marseille, Antwerp, Hamburg, streets filled with chants. For many Europeans of African descent, this was the first time they felt part of a truly global movement, one that transcended nationality and language. Meanwhile, on African soil, the mobilization intensified. In Ghana, students marched through Accra, waving both national and Burkina Faso flags. In Liberia, grassroots groups took to the streets, affirming their solidarity with the Alliance of Sahel states. In Nigeria, civil society organizations organized rallies where speakers reminded the crowd of colonial scars and the need for unity. Each country added its own verse to the same song, "Hands Off Africa." What made these demonstrations remarkable was not only their size but their diversity. they were not confined to recent migrants or activists. Third and fourth generation African Americans joined with Caribbean communities, European-born Africans, and allies from different ethnicities. The protests were multicolored, multilingual, yet all carried one voice. It was not a voice of despair, but of defiance. Elders in the diaspora, many in their 60s and 70s, compared the atmosphere to the marches of the 1960s. They spoke of déjà vu, the same determination, the same spiritual energy. Only this time, the struggle was not limited to one nation's civil rights. It was about Africa itself reclaiming its dignity. This cross-continental mobilization revealed a truth that frightened Western policymakers: Africa was no longer isolated. The diaspora, empowered by digital tools and collective memory, could shut down streets in Washington while echoing chants in Accra. The boundaries of geography collapsed under the weight of solidarity. This was not just protest. It was the living proof of a new global force. Backhand index pointing right. If you believe these voices must never be silenced, type "Africa can do it" in the comments and subscribe to stand with this rising tide. Inside the White House, the first reports of protests reached advisors like background noise. A few African rallies, one aide whispered, as if it were nothing new. But as the hours turned into days, and the streets of Washington, New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles remained blocked, even the most dismissive voices grew uneasy. What unsettled them was not simply the size of the gatherings. It was their persistence, their discipline, their unyielding message: hands off Africa. Donald Trump, still carrying the defiant tone of his earlier years, initially brushed the events aside. He told staff that America had weathered protests before, that the news cycle would move on. Yet when he saw footage of highways shut down and crowds waving both the Stars and Stripes and the Burkina Faso flag, his posture shifted. Reports say he slammed his hand on the desk, declaring he had never seen foreign flags dominate American streets in this way. The symbolism pierced his pride. An emergency briefing was called. Intelligence officials outlined the chain of events: the alleged coup attempt in Ouagadougou, General Michael Langley's explosive accusations, and the sudden diaspora mobilization. Instead of calming the president, the information deepened his frustration. He had expected scattered protests. What he faced was organized disruption in multiple cities, amplified by social media platforms that refused to let the story fade. The silence from his own accounts spoke volumes. Normally quick to tweet provocations, Trump's digital voice fell quiet. Analysts speculated that he did not know how to frame the uprising. Any attempt to dismiss it risked alienating African American voters. Any attempt to confront it risked inflaming tensions further. For a man who thrived on control of narrative, the silence was telling. Meanwhile, inside the State Department, the mood was different but no less tense. Senior officials admitted they had underestimated the diaspora. For decades, African policy had been conducted in relative obscurity, with little domestic scrutiny. Now, think tanks like the Council on Foreign Relations found their events disrupted by activists. The Africa Society, usually a quiet platform for policy elites, faced pickets at its doors. Seasoned diplomats confessed privately, "We are not used to an organized constituency on African issues. This changes everything." What terrified them most was not only the disruption. It was the exposure of hypocrisy. Protesters carried signs that read, "You said democracy, but you back coups." Others asked why billions could be spent on foreign interventions while schools in Detroit and hospitals in Lagos crumbled. The chants were not just noise. They were arguments, sharpened by history and personal memory. Mainstream media tried to shrink the story. CNN gave it a few minutes, MSNBC almost nothing, and Fox News painted it as traffic chaos caused by outsiders. Yet the alternative media sphere told another tale. YouTube channels streamed live from protest lines. TikTok videos captured chants echoing under New York bridges. Podcasts dissected the geopolitics with a clarity absent from television. Hashtags like hashtag Africaracing and hashtag HandsOffAES trend for days. In this arena, the diaspora had its own megaphone, immune to editorial filters. For older African Americans, especially those in their 60s and 70s, the parallel was unavoidable. They recalled the 1960s marches, the fire hoses, the church songs. To see younger generations, joined by immigrants from across the continent, standing against imperial narratives revived memories of Selma, Montgomery, and Washington. They whispered that perhaps this was the global continuation of the struggle they once led. This realization rattled power in unexpected ways. What began as a challenge to Western dominance in the Sahel had now landed squarely in American domestic politics. Every official knew, ignoring the movement would not make it vanish. The question became urgent: if a 37-year-old soldier from a small West African nation could unsettle the might of Washington, what else could he inspire? Backhand index pointing right. If you believe even the strongest empires can be challenged by truth, type "It's time for Africa" in the comments and subscribe to keep this conversation alive. History often moves in whispers before it erupts in thunder. The protests of April 2025 were more than a reaction to General Michael Langley's accusations or to rumors of a coup. They were the sound of history returning, the echo of voices long silenced now speaking with renewed force. For many Africans and people of African descent, this moment felt like a circle finally closing. The names invoked on placards told the story clearly: Marcus Garvey, Kwame Nkrumah, Thomas Sankara. These were not random choices. Each represented an era when Africa dared to dream of freedom on its own terms. Garvey spoke of a global black nation united beyond borders. Nkrumah shouted for a free and united continent. Sankara, a son of Burkina Faso, lived and died insisting that Africa could stand without chains. By placing Captain Ibrahim Traoré's name beside theirs, protesters were not exaggerating. They were declaring continuity, a torch passed from one generation to the next. What made this moment distinct was the scale of its reach. Garvey built his movement with ships and newspapers. Nkrumah relied on the fervor of independence rallies. Sankara electrified crowds with speeches in Ouagadougou. But in 2025, a simple clip of Captain Ibrahim's latest news could circle the globe within hours. A sentence delivered in Ouagadougou could spark chants in London the same night. Digital networks collapsed the distance that colonial borders once enforced. This was why elders in Harlem and Lagos alike called it an awakening. They had lived through decades when Africa's struggles were dismissed as regional conflicts. They had seen leaders assassinated, economies strangled, hopes deferred. Yet now, through the strength of a connected diaspora, the tables were turning. Every protest in Washington or Berlin showed Western capitals that Africa was not isolated anymore. A policy decision made in Paris could trigger resistance in Chicago within days. And the symbolism did not end with politics. Protest art blossomed. Painters in Dakar created murals of Ibrahim Tra holding a torch. Musicians in Kingston released reggae tracks chanting "Hands Off Africa." Spoken word poets in London linked the names of Lumumba, Sankara, and Traoré as verses of the same unfinished poem. It was a cultural renaissance as much as a political one. This renaissance carried a profound lesson: dignity cannot be delayed forever. For too long, the image of Africa in Western media was one of famine, war, or dependence. Now, images of proud defiance, of multigenerational crowds marching in unity, flooded alternative media feeds. It was a counter-narrative, a declaration that Africa was not begging for charity but demanding respect. The impact reached even into policy circles. Analysts warned that any attempt to remove Traoré could provoke not just African unrest but political backlash in Western democracies. Elections could be swayed by how diaspora voters perceived foreign policy. Burkina Faso latest news was no longer a footnote in obscure reports. It was a headline capable of unsettling alliances, a phrase loaded with the weight of resistance. Still, the moment carried its risks. History had taught hard lessons: Lumumba killed, Sankara betrayed, Gaddafi destroyed. Protesters knew the dangers of revolutionary hope. Yet they marched anyway. Hope, even when fragile, was stronger than fear. This duality of risk and renewal was what made April 2025 unforgettable. It reminded the world that Africa's story is not linear defeat but cycles of resurgence. Each generation rises again, scarred yet unbroken. Ibrahim Tra embodied that spirit, not as a flawless savior but as a symbol that Africa refuses to remain silent. For the diaspora, the protests became more than solidarity. They became a mirror. African Americans, Caribbean communities, and Europeans of African descent saw their own long struggles reflected in Africa's defiance. When highways were blocked in New York, when embassies trembled in London, when songs were sung in Ouagadougou, it was not just about one leader. It was about black dignity everywhere. And that is the meaning of legacy, not a single man standing alone, but a chain of courage stretching across centuries. Backhand index pointing right. If you believe this legacy must be carried forward, type Africa New in the comments and subscribe to honor those who fought before and those who rise today. The protests of April 2025 were not a passing storm. They were a declaration. From the crowded streets of Washington to the sunlit boulevards of Ouagadougou, a single truth rang clear: Africa is no longer a silent spectator in its own destiny. Captain Ibrahim's latest news was not simply about one man's defiance. It was about a continent remembering its voice, a people reclaiming the dignity stolen by centuries of interference. For too long, Western capitals believed Africa could be managed in secrecy, policies drafted in closed rooms, decisions forced upon millions without consent. But the global uprising showed that era has ended. Every attempt at manipulation now faces a watchful diaspora, ready to march, to speak, to disrupt. Burkina Faso's latest news is no longer background noise, it is a headline shaping global politics. The legacy of Marcus Garvey, Thomas Sankara, and Kwame Nkrumah lives again in this generation. And Ibrahim Tra stands as proof that courage can still inspire across borders. His name is spoken not only in Burkina Faso but in churches of Atlanta, in streets of London, in classrooms of Accra. This is the power of solidarity when one leader's stand becomes a chorus of millions. The question now is ours to answer. Will this awakening fade, or will it become the dawn of a truly free Africa? Will the chants of Hands Off Africa be remembered as a moment, or as the beginning of a movement that reshaped the world? If you feel the fire in these words, do not stay silent. Write your voice into history. Comment below, New Africa. Share this story. Subscribe because they hid our history long enough. Now it is time to speak our future out loud. Captain Ibrahim's latest news will continue to echo. It is not the end of a chapter but the opening of a book yet to be written. And as long as voices rise, as long as banners fly, as long as hearts beat for justice, the world will know, Africa stands tall.